welcome back to the Solo RolePlayers Podcast. I'm your host PJ, and today I have another interview with one of the content creators who helped me get started to actually stop just researching everything and actually play my game. So this particular guest has come up on almost every other interview that we've done on this show in one way, shape, or form. I've heard her referred to as our unofficial leader on this solo RPG Reddit threads. Welcome to the show, Deborah from GeekGamers.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm humbled by that introduction, and I did listen to some of the other episodes, and I was surprised to hear that I did come up. So I really do appreciate that. And as I'm not on Reddit, I hadn't heard that before. So that's going to give me something to carry me through the weekend. That's really nice to hear.
Oh, that's lovely. Now, you are up very early in the morning to join me today, so I really appreciate that to start.
No problem. It's actually appropriate because most of the videos and filming that I do and the writing of my book, I do very early in the morning. So this feels like my gaming time, actually.
Well, that is very fortuitous. That works out well. Now, the reason that you have come up so often in my discussions in the past on this show, both on the show and actually your name does get dropped quite a lot on the Reddit threads. And a large part of that reason is because you are the author of the book, The Solo GameMasters Guide, which was one of, I think it was actually the key resource between that and Mythic, was the key resource that actually got me to be able to play. Mythic from a mechanical point of view, and the Solo GameMasters Guide from more of a philosophical point of view. And I do want to dig into this book a little bit because it is such a fantastic resource for anyone interested in doing solo role-playing. But to begin with, I do imagine that there's a story of how you discovered and got into RPGs in the first place, and then subsequently solo role-playing. So would you tell us a bit about that, about your introduction?
Absolutely, I will, yes. It's a story that's maybe common to a lot of girls who were interested in role-playing back in the 80s, say, in the 90s, where there were mostly boys playing, and I was really fascinated by Dungeons and Dragons, but it was very hard to get into a group because the boys just didn't really want to play with the girls in that way. And so I spent a lot of time reading basically D&D at that point is really what I had access to. And as you do, I rolled up some characters and I just started creating characters and reading the books and sort of slowly putting them into situations. And that's really how I personally started. I'm an only child, so I didn't have siblings around to play with. It's also how I started doing a lot of solo board gaming, although I will say my exposure to RPGs was much more sophisticated than my board gaming at that young age, which was really limited to like Risk and Monopoly and the kinds of things that, at least in the States, we played as kids. So that's how I started as a child doing that. And then as I began my YouTube channel, my YouTube channel actually started as covering mostly war games and kind of fantasy war games and war games that were not covered already on YouTube. And if you know the history of wargaming, as I know you do, because it's come up in other conversations, even on your own podcast, there's a very close relationship between RPGs and war games. And in fact, RPGs grew out of war game rule sets. So some of the war games that I had played as a child and that I covered on the channel were very linked to RPGs. And in 2017, I covered one of my favorite games that I had when I was a kid, which was the James Bond Assault war game from 1986.
Wow.
And in that game, the rules explicitly say to you, you can take the James Bond RPG. There was a James Bond RPG that was published first in 83 and revised, I think, up through 87. And it said you could take those rules and kind of play them out in our board game. And that's what I did. I did that on the channel, and I posted it in 2017. And I think that was one of the very first videos on YouTube that tried to do something that was akin to solo RPG, because of course I was playing this by myself. The James Bond Assault war game is not a solo game, but I was creating systems and structures to play it on my own. And that was the first video I posted that was about solo RPG, and it sort of took off from there.
So just to step back for a second there. So you just said that you had been interested and involved with D&D, at least reading the books. Were you actually playing solo then by creating ways to do so? Or is that only an idea that came after you discovered this James Bond RPG board game hybrid?
Well, I would say that, again, getting back to, what I say in my book, sort of any interaction with RPG is playing, quote unquote. However, in terms of saying a framework, this is solo RPG, I can't honestly say I was doing that. I was making characters as a kid. I would make characters. I would read something like in the GM guide about a dungeon or a setting, and then sort of say to myself, my character is in that setting or trying to open a door and roll the dice, that kind of thing. So I would do that. Did I call it solo RPG in my mind? Absolutely not as a kid. When I began to do this on the channel, I did. And there was a moment I published my video, which is still my most popular video, Easy Ways to Be Your Own GM. I think that came in 2017. I can't remember the date also, where explicitly I posted my framework for considering aspects of things you need to do solo RPG. And I expand on that, of course, in my book. But at a certain point, I did put the framework on it. But as a child, no, I just was, as probably tons of kids did, messing around with a character and rolling some dice.
Sure. And my son does exactly the same thing with D&D, actually, at the moment. Or gets one mate in and just, makes up stuff and just likes to roll the dice a lot, and they have a lot of fun doing that, So
it's great,
but
yeah.
I'm interested, though. This is around 2017 now, and the channel sort of slowly started going more towards the solo RPG stuff. You said that when you did that most popular video, you started putting out some general advice, was it, or framework to be able to do that? This is before you wrote the book, though, or before you decided to write the book?
It is, yes. The video came first, and I'll say as a little bit of my background, because it is integral, I think, to what we're talking about here, and my approach, and why I ended up writing the book the way I did, and why I ended up posting a lot of general videos the way I did, is that in the real world, I am a book editor, and I've been a book editor for my whole career, and I also have a PhD in literature. So
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I've taught as well. And when I think about what solo RPG is, as I write about in the book, and I've probably mentioned in various ways on the channel, to me, it is like playable fiction. It's game storytelling. It's using apparatus like dice and randomizers to tell a story. So very much I'm approaching the concept from ideas about what makes narrative work, what makes stories interesting. And that became the approach that I did on the channel with the types of videos I was making, like how to create theme, how to recognize theme in solo RPG, or what are elements of storytelling. And these are the kinds of things that found their way into the book. So for me, it was very natural to create a type of framework for what this actually was. And in fact, the Easy Ways to Be Your Own GM video almost started as a review of a game supplement called the Tome of Adventure Design, which is
just recently got that.
Yeah, a massive, excellent collection of essentially random tables. But as I started to think about that, I began to think about the framework and post that. And really, honestly, the impetus for the book was that video sort of, I think, took off in a way which was great. But I found and heard other channels and people talking about the concepts that I put out in the video without attributing them to me. And I felt, as a book editor, I know you can't copyright an idea, but you can copyright the expression of an idea. And to me, it was important to kind of codify the fact that this was my expression of this idea. For other people to use, absolutely, as long as there was attribution. And So there's really no way to control attribution, of course, but I thought I could really develop this into a book. And I focused on doing that. It came about largely as a result of the pandemic, where, along with so many other people, I was feeling anxious, and I often wake up early anyway, but I was waking up even earlier. And I started thinking about all the videos I had posted at that point, and that's how the book came together. And I wrote it probably mostly between 2 and 4 a.m. when I should have been sleeping, and to avoid worrying about the pandemic.
Wow. Yeah, so many pandemic related stories and backgrounds in, I mean, I think role playing in general, right? But also in solo role playing. It's certainly come up more than once in the discussions that I've had.
Certainly. And I think obviously I had begun posting many solo RPG videos well before the pandemic, but clearly the pandemic helped take off that concept. There were, I think, I would attribute a number of different things over the course of 10 plus years that created the solo RPG community as we have it now, and what causes it to thrive, the pandemic being the most recent one, but not the only thing.
Yeah. Coming back to your literature background for a second there, I think I said that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's because, unlike other supplements that I've read or systems for playing solo, you can really see in the Solo GameMasters Guide that there is such a narrative focus. Like, all of it is narrative focus pretty much. You go from, I mean, you talk about don't even learn the rules necessarily, or playing a system playing solo without a system or without a character, stripping away a lot of those mechanical things, presumably because people, like, there is space in there for people to add in the mechanics that they want to use anyway. But it is really clear that it's more from a narrative, almost philosophical perspective. And that's what I think I've found most helpful about reading this book. It was understand and embrace that everything is play, and as soon as you do that, then it becomes less daunting to put in the work involved to be able to play how you want to play. But the biggest thing that helped me, and actually this is the thing that I repeat of yours, crediting you in the Reddit threads, as when people ask questions, how do I get started, is how to create that world and that character, or rather create the world around the character, or the opposite. Create the world and then drop the character into it with some thread that will then naturally, organically be allowed to grow and expand. Is that a reasonable representation of that core idea in your book?
Yes, absolutely. And I think I give an example in the book. I can't remember if this is the example, but I'll give it here, which is if you imagine someone, say, standing on the street, just a person standing on a blank street, and that that the person is a librarian, versus imagining a library. And the library is the environment. And it's so much easier when you think of it that way to imagine dropping someone into the concept of the library and having a story, as opposed to just seeing someone and being told they're a librarian, because there's no feeling of a story evolving there. And I think what trips people up, which makes total sense, is that as a soloist, if you're approaching a traditional rule set, the place in the rules that has something mapped out for you to do on your own already is character creation. So it is natural to sit down and create characters. That's what I did when I was a kid, as I said, and that's what many people do. But I find that is much more challenging than to go, if you're using a rule set, to go to a rule set and roll up an environment, to find some random tables to give you an environment, and then start to think about what type of character might be in this environment. And depending on what character you put in there, there's a relationship already between the character and the environment. So to use my other example, if you put a librarian into a library, you can imagine a certain relationship, as opposed to if you put a patron, somebody looking for a book, into the library. There's a different relationship there.
Yeah.
And I think, just to go back a little bit to what you said about my book, and I really appreciate that characterization of it, because I think that is what I am essentially writing about, is narrative. And I've been told by people, well, you could really write this book as GM advice, like forget the solo part, that it's just about sort of interacting as a GM. I received a comment on the channel, and I use it as the epigraph to the introduction of the book. It said something along the lines of that I could take 3 pebbles, a stone, and 5 sticks and create an awesome RPG, which was one of the comments that really warmed my heart, because I do think that what I'm trying to help people understand and realize is that they can do that. It is possible to create an RPG story on your own using all sorts of things, or not using a rule set, or using a rule from one rule set and using 5 rules from another. And feeling the freedom to do that, I think, is possible if you have some certain understanding of narrative concepts and understanding basic tenets about narrative. I think gives you something to lean on and feel freedom from rules.
Yeah. That's a really interesting approach, and I think that's the thing that comes up so often in the people that I interact with, both online and on the show. And actually, due to this podcast, I've had people now begin to email me or reach out and stuff and talk about how my discussions with various other content creators and the advice that they gave has sort of helped them get playing. And there is this sense of there's a lot more interest out there from people than bravery or understanding or whatever it requires, or some kind of an angle in your head, whatever it requires to actually start crafting those stories. And so we often do talk about advice for people for how to get started. And I think we'll come back to that a little bit later on. I usually end it with a bit of advice for solo role-playing. But I wanted to share a little experience with you, if you don't mind.
Of course.
Because I've started for this show, I've started doing some sort of like one-shot actual plays as a way to sort of get books off the shelf and sort of experiment with these ideas that I've learned about from books like yours or books like Mythic specifically. And yesterday, for the first time, I tried exactly what you're talking about. I picked up a rule system that I knew absolutely nothing about. I spent 15 minutes, 20 minutes flicking through and pulling out bits that looked interesting to me based on the headline or the topic or whatever it was, whether that was the setting in the world or particular parts of the rule set, and then just allowed some characters to form in my mind based on the names or imagery from locations, based on some of the political stuff that's going on in the world. And really, in about 20 minutes, I found not trying to create a character, but just trying to pull interesting things out of the lore in the book and out of the world building, that characters just started to form in my head. And it was such a fantastic, which is the best use of the word, I think, fantastic experience for that to be able to happen. And then all I did was sit down and did a basic setup. So we're going to start in the middle of some sort of action. This is how these 2 characters are going to meet, and sort of preloaded Mythic with a couple of other characters that I flicked through randomly in the book, characters or locations, just to sort of help the story to get going, and an objective, which was one cool thing this book has, is it has a list of valuable books in this world, of grimoires or whatever, magical books that are legendary. And one of them happened to be a book with 20 volumes. And I thought, well, that's great. This seems to go with this character. She can go and search for these books, and bam, there's my story. And now when I go to sit down, hopefully after this interview, to actually play, I feel like the world is already there waiting for me to explore. And I haven't read the rule book.
Oh, that's great to hear. That's wonderful to hear. And I think that is the essence. You're describing the essence of what can be the magic of solo RPG, which is that you somehow do create something that's compelling outside of yourself, that's not created by another person, the GM. Your narrative is working for itself. And I think that is, like I said, rare, but what people really, the payoff, right? the payoff is you are creating something and seeing it come alive. And I do think that the environment as you describe it and having things jump out at you as opposed to trying to create something or put a framework on top of something is it is challenging. It's almost like sitting down to write a novel or a short story. You've got this blank piece of paper. It feels really intimidating. But I think one of the pieces of advice I give in the GM guide, and it sounds like exactly what you were doing, is to really start small. My favorite thing is to roll on a trinket table as the very first thing, like the smallest, there's a pearl lying in the dirt or whatever, and just really focus on something small and see what big can come out of it. Because when you sit down to think like, I'm going to have this is the religious system and this is the governmental system and all of these things that one might do, say, if you're creating a big campaign as a GM with other players, to try to do that on your own, I find that impossible and intimidating. So I love to hear how that organically grew, and you're drawn to something that seems to exist outside of you, even when you're not there, and that's really effective storytelling.
Yeah. And that is, for me, that is absolutely the experience that I'm looking for. I mean, I like mechanics of role playing as well. Like I do like crafting equipment, leveling up characters, rolling dice, doing all that sort of stuff as well. But that is so much more satisfying when the world that these characters are in is just beckoning them to come into it. And it almost feels effortless then, I have found, just in this experience yesterday. It almost feels effortless. I mean, again, I'll start actually playing after this, but I feel like it's going to be easy to just see where the characters go. And actually, I heard an interview with an author, a normal author, non-RPG author. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Irish author Sally Rooney. She wrote a great book called Normal People.
Yes, I think she's everywhere now. I
Right.
have to admit, I haven't read her, but she has some great publicists because she is, even in the States, on all media. I mean, she's everywhere. She's even in New York Magazine, which is a kind of local publication, and there was a big article about her. So,
yeah, good on her. But I had only read one of her books. My wife's a big fan of hers, and I'm just about to start her newest book as well. But I was listening to an interview with her on a podcast because I was traveling for work, and I happened to see it and recognize the name. And something that she said, she was asked, why does all her characters sort of seem the same, like, or some sort of question about her writing process. And she said that she doesn't plan or map out this whole big story, but rather she has these characters come to her, and then she wants to see where they take her in the story. And that's something that I don't think I've heard an author say before, or maybe I wasn't listening out for it, but it's something I can really imagine authors doing, never having really written all that much myself. But that felt exactly like the experience to me of what this solo role-playing is. And without having the need to, I mean, like you say, if you want to sit down and write a whole novel, that feels really, really daunting. But if you're open to allowing the story to draw itself out of the world or the characters or something like that, then all of a sudden it feels a whole lot less daunting and feels just about manageable for, I think, most people to be able to do.
Right. Absolutely. That's great. That's a wonderful approach to storytelling. And I do think that people playing solo RPG would do well to think about stories in that way and think about the types of books they read, if they read books outside of game playing, and what compels them. Because the core question, what I say in my book, but I can't take credit for the idea, it's from E.M. Forster, is what you really want to know is what happens next. And that's the challenge, that's the appeal, that's the draw. If you can get into a situation where you yourself want to know what happens next based on the characters you've created, based on the environment that they're in, based on the interaction they just had, you are doing something that does provide that kind of unique enjoyment that I think solo RPG can offer. And it's also, I think, one of the reasons why I I said in my book, and it's demonstrated on my channel, that before I pick up dice to roll, especially on an oracle table, which I find to be, as I have a whole chapter in this, sometimes leading really to a dead end, I really think hard about that. Do I need to do that? Or is there something compelling me in what I have with the story that I can just go with? And the freedom to do that and feeling like it's okay to just make that decision. I think that that's one of the obstacles that I still challenge myself with sometimes, where I feel like, okay, I should really be making a skill check here as opposed to just saying I'm doing it. But that is a challenge that happens sometimes.
But like I believe you say in that same chapter as well, if you are going to roll, then make sure that you already kind of know one of two paths that it might take. Do you say that as well, or am I making that up?
I don't know if I say it that way, but I think what I say is that, first of all, if you don't want to roll something to necessarily, let me rephrase this, that if you're rolling for a decision like an oracle, then it really should just be, it kind of doesn't matter to you ultimately, and you're just trying to get a direction one way or another. But if you're rolling and you kind of hope that the roll is going to lead you in one direction, you should not make that roll, because that hope is your existing narrative, right? Your, you know what you want to do, and that you have a narrative picture that you want to follow, and you should just feel free to do that.
I think that's really fantastic advice. And I have come across that situation in my my other podcasts, where I actually do the narrative of my solo role playing. A few times in that it's come up as like, oh, I really hope that they're not there or something like that. And then I have to think, well, actually, I need to just give myself permission and,
Right.
Or occasionally I roll anyway and say, I realize how much I hoped that they weren't there, and then just go, okay, no, forget that, they weren't there.
Right. And I struggle with this as well. I'll say both on the channel and off the channel, where I feel like, okay, I should be doing a roll here. It's gone on too long with my just sort of saying this is happening and looking around and finding this thing. And of course, I say that to admit that I struggle with this problem too, because you have the dice there, you have the mechanics, you have the rules, you should be using them in some way. And then, of course, again, you don't need to be.
Yeah. So you're just describing there, you sitting there with your dice, with your tools, whatever your setup is. Could you give for the listeners just a little bit of a description of how it is you actually play? Are you writing just bullet points? Are you writing large amounts of notes? Are you mostly playing on the channel? How does that look like for you these days?
Well, it's changed a lot over the years. To be honest, at this point, I am mostly playing on the channel, but not always. I have some ongoing games, we'll call them, that I go back to. So they're sort of ongoing in the box, like Four Against Darkness. I have a ton of stuff for that, and I've done many videos on it, and I have existing characters in a box. So I will pick that up and play that just ongoing, not on the channel. And there are some of the kind of solo zines that I've played on the channel that I really like, that I go back to. We could talk about some of those later on. But in terms of like a blank setup and what I'm doing, I have a very few of I have an office full of supplements, right? But I have a few that I find myself coming back to time and again if I want to play something. Like we already mentioned, the Tome of Adventure Design, which is a massive book, but smaller things too, like the Deck of Many Dungeons, which is a 52 card deck. Well, it's 54 cards with the Jokers, that has some pre-made dungeon segments on them and names of dungeons. I find that very evocative to go back to. That's pretty small. I will use some of the tools in my own book because I selected them because I thought they were very useful. So to me, that's a great shortcut. That really has what I need and prefer in it. But I will sit down with a rule set and immediately go to see what type of random tables it offers, again, for the environment or for specific settings or in world or something that that rule set does that maybe others don't. So, for example, some rule sets will go into you have random tables to make your own magic item, just as an example. Many rule sets won't have that. They might just have a list of magic items. So if I'm with a rule set that offers something that seems a little different than other rule sets, I'm going to focus on that because that says to me, this interested the designer. It's probably very well crafted and it gives me something new to do. So in the example of the magic item one, you could roll up, well, where did this item come from? What does it do? What's the history of it? And that I will allow myself as a way in to the rule set. Then maybe I'll look and see what they offer in terms of a setting, or if they don't, I'll go outside it. So when I look at a new rule set, I'm really trying to see what the designer themselves seems to be focusing on. And I will interact with that rule set before I make a video on it. So I have something of personal experience to say, or if I'm demonstrating a actual demo of play on the channel, most often it's not the first time I've worked with a rule set because I want to understand what it is. But I do allow myself to let the author of the designer, the writer of that rule set, kind of guide me by seeing what they think is different in their rule set and taking that as a starting place.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I really like that idea. You talked about some of the tools that you sort of have at hand. What are some of those rule sets, though, that you have been enjoying recently?
So the rule sets, I've recently done a bunch of videos on Shadow Dark, which I know has been in the kind of RPG news of late. I find that to be very useful for solo. It has a lot of tables and it has something that's very useful, which are random tables of different terrain areas. So it offers you something outside of a dungeon. I mean, I adore dungeons like everybody else. And in fact, I have a whole chapter in my book on why dungeons are so compelling. But it is nice to be able to open up a book and have a table of events and things that might happen in ruins or in the hills or whatever. I always go back to Knave and Fallen. Those are rules that have tons of random tables. They are kind of rules light, as it were. I think to understand the context of what we're talking about here with rule sets, there are different types of rule sets that a soloist could think about using. There are those that are really created for what I would call traditional play, meaning a GM and players that may have some solo supplements, but effectively they're not solo rule sets, excuse me. And then there are rules that have a little bit more solo support built in. One of my favorite ones is Forbidden Lands, which I'm sure you've talked about already on other podcasts. And I've done a bunch of videos on that. I think I would consider that a solo supported rule set. It's wonderful and it's great, I think, for somebody new to solo RPG to pick up because of the supported offers. An older one is Scarlet Heroes. That was one of the earlier ones. I can't remember when that was first published. So those are solo supported, but still pretty traditional. And then there's the proliferation in recent years, and I say that in a good way, not in a bad way, of what I would consider like one-offs or solo zines or solo games that are self-contained in a short product, like Thousand Empty Light is one of my favorites. That's a sci-fi kind of thing, or The Librarian's Apprentice, or The Quiet Year, or Thousand-Year-Old Vampire. These are or Artifact is a favorite one of mine, where you're basically building a magic item. These are things that have really come to the fore in the past 5+ years, where people are just creating a very focused idea, like being a librarian's apprentice or trying to escape from a sunken ship, and made mechanics around that you can play out as a story. So that is also solo RPG. It's very different than trying to approach a larger rule set, what we've been talking about up until now, mostly in this podcast, and create your story out of that. So some of what I do is going to depend on the materials that I'm actually using, what type of rules I'm actually using.
And are you choosing them based on the different feeling you want to get? Like
Well,
when you choose which game you're going to play, or
right. It depends again if I'm choosing something for the channel, or if a designer reaches out to me, or if I reach out to a designer, it's because of something that seems to me unique, or there is a type of setting or approach that I'm really interested in, like the Librarian's Apprentice, for example. That kind of hit a lot of notes for me, being a sort of bookworm, as it were. The concept of playing a story out as a librarian's apprentice immediately appealed to me. But I think for a kind of generic fantasy, and I don't mean that derogatory at all, because that's my default, like, home base is just generic fantasy. I'm looking for something that I would like a lot of random tables. I would like a lot of prompts, because to me, prompts, and I have some of these in my GM guide, and obviously a lot of designers write them, where you have like an action word and a theme word, or a noun and a verb. Putting those types of open-ended prompts to me are very inspiring and really help me develop a story. So rule sets that come with a lot of those, I appreciate, or I just go to the ones that are in my own book. But I don't know. I don't think I have a particular set of criteria for what interests me at any given time. Part of what's so great about the RPG world in general is it's just, you could be doing anything, as the mood strikes you. So sometimes I'll feel like going back to games I have that are in the box, like I mentioned, Four Against Darkness or D100 Dungeon. I've played a lot of Ironsworn, etc., because I want that type of feeling, and those are all very different feelings.
Sure. And arguably there are certainly systems that have more or less impotence to have narrative in there, Like Four Against Darkness, I don't know if you're going through these big world building narrative moments when you play that, or whether that's more of a mechanical experience when you play
Four
it.
Against Darkness for me is a way of having I have so many different characters that I've made it so easy to make a character, and there are so many different combinations. So to me, Four Against Darkness, it's almost like a jocular kind of feel. I put, four characters together and they're sort of laughing, oh, hey, where did you come from, kind of thing, and sending them through. So there's like a more lightheartedness. The mechanics fall to the background, and it's really like what type of characters I can make there. Whereas something like Ironsworn, which I think is an amazing rule set, not something I would recommend for somebody just getting into solo RPG. I don't think it's that intuitive. That to me is a more serious, modulated play, where I feel there's a grandiosity to it, like with making your iron vows and setting out on this amazing journey that has a very different kind of feeling. And I have to be really in the mood for that kind of feeling to take out that rule set. But it offers something, I think, quite unique in the genre of solo RPG. I can't really think of anything else like it in terms of the feeling, the magisterial feeling, I guess, that it engenders and wants to. So again, what I get out of it is a lot dependent on what that rule set particularly is, or if I'm playing something like one of these solo zines where it's, say, a mapping game. Obviously, what I'm doing there is very specific to mapping, and my expectation is not necessarily for a great narrative moment where I'm encountering some, warlock unexpectedly. I'm doing a mapping. And so I think the enjoyment, again, is going to be based on what is your expectation, and are you getting a rule set that can match those expectations?
Yeah. And that, I think, that is a really key point that I think people do get stuck with a little bit, because when you're just coming into this, maybe you're not sure how diverse the options for the play styles and play types and possibilities actually are. And like you say, so often Starforged or Ironsworn get recommended as a first place for people to start, And I completely agree with you. I think they're fantastic, and I understand why people recommend it, because it is a more guided approach in terms of you crossing off, like you have the vows, you have clear goals, clear moves that you can do, that kind of thing. And I get that. But also, like you say, if you were to come into this never having played anything and look at this massive rule set, I think it absolutely turns people off. Or in the other end of things, I see people talking about, I want to get into solo role-playing, and I got 1,000-Year-Old Vampire, and I don't like writing all that much, And it's like, well, maybe that's not the right system for you to start with then.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm not a huge fan of journaling games at all. I do like 1,000-Year-Old Vampire because I just love vampires, but I feel I do a lot of writing in my job and I don't need to be writing. I'm not a journaling person, although obviously that's a whole subgenre of the subgenre. But I agree. I think again with Ironsworn, it feels intimidating to be setting out. Well, it's like you're trying to play Game of Thrones or something, which I get that. I read the books, I watched the series, I love it. But to try to sit down and be that character and do that, I get the desire for that feeling, but I do think that's a big step up. For me, it's a big step up to sit down and say, I'm going to do this now. So certainly for somebody who is just trying to get into it, it's not something I would recommend. I think there are a lot of easier ways, especially if you have been a role player, if you have played D&D or any system that you played in a group. If that is you and you're deciding for whatever reason you want to do solo, stick with something you already know. Go back to that, look at it with fresh eyes, look at it from the perspective of a solo GM. I have put tons of videos on my channel. I have a whole section in my book on the mindset of the solo GM. Understand what that means and go to a rule set whatever that might be, because that already is going to be easier for you than just something totally alien to you.
Or I would add a world that you really know, or a setting, or one that you really are interested in.
Right. Yes.
My experience, I have almost no RPG background at all when I started doing this. And I got into it because I saw that there was a Fallout RPG released by Modiphius. And I was a big Fallout fan back in the day. Those were the video games that got me started playing games. And so I just knew I wanted to play around in that world. And then through things like the Solo GameMasters Guide and through Mythic, was able to just jump in and realize this is fantastic. What else is out there?
Right. Yeah, it's a totally great point, because, for example, I didn't play Fallout. I did play video games. I didn't play Fallout. And I'm familiar with, I know that there's the RPG because Modiphius is my publisher as well. But to me, that would be so hard to get into because I don't really know what it is. I'd have to learn the whole world. So absolutely. I mean, your example there is right on point, that if there's a way of making it easier for yourself, you should take that way. Now, ultimately, one might decide, well, I don't really want to be doing D&D. I want to be doing something else or these solo zines, but at least you've gotten into it. And then you can sort of start to figure out, as you say, there's such an array of rule sets and play styles that you can choose and figure out what really works for you.
Yeah. And I think that is key as well. And that's something that comes up all the time. And I find in more areas of life than just solo role playing, but just trying, just starting, just sitting down and doing it. I think there's a lot of fear out there that people are going to get it wrong, or they're going to sit down and it's not going to be what they had hoped, and then it's all been a failure, or, and all these kind of feelings, which are very strange when you have no one watching you or judging you. But I feel like people still have them.
They do. And I think I know why. And I think there is something inherently almost embarrassing that you might feel. It's like, well, this is really something that's designed to be played with a lot of people. And even though it's become a thing, I mean, honestly, I feel this way sometimes too, off camera. If I've sat, now, of course, if it's on camera, you're not going to see it because I would edit it out. But if I started off camera and something died on the vine, it's just a little embarrassing because it kind of points out to you like, am I really doing this because like I don't have friends that I can play this game with? And of course, no, you're not. And there's something very different about the experience of playing solo RPG. I think there's more a closer relationship to the narrative development, which
Yep.
is what I get out of it. Something very different. And I say this in my book. I probably have said it on the channel in some way. For me, solo RPG and what I would call, say, regular RPG, what they have in common is just the RPG initials. It's really not, it's not the same experience. I don't think it's meant to be. I'm not trying to simulate, because I don't think you can,
No.
what it is
Nor
like
should
to
you.
sit, nor should you, sit around the table with a bunch of friends and a GM and get that experience. To me, it's very, very different. So I think that's why it becomes hard sometimes, that you're sitting there and it falls flat, and that kind of highlights all the secret reasons why you think maybe this is just kind of an embarrassing thing to try to do.
Yeah. But having that, I think having that, giving yourself that permission or realization that it is different and it's not trying to be the same thing, I think is really important. And permission to fail or cheat or change the rules or, all those sorts of things.
Yeah, it's very freeing.
Have you had experience as a GM as well, or as a player more
The
broadly?
only experience I've had as a GM is for my kids.
Mm-hmm.
So I have limited experience and no desire to be a GM. I think being a GM is an amazing thing. And as if you've, played any amount of tabletop role playing, we'll call it that, around a table with other people, you know that good GMs can be hard to find.
Mm.
And I'm looking for a good GM right now. I'm in a place where I want to play in a group. I never really regularly did play in a group. I'll say that as well. This is also something that sort of propelled me toward continuing to do solo role playing as I got older. I never really found a group to play in. And I also didn't have a lot of time when I was, say, in my 20s to play that, because I was working full time and getting my PhD. And it was a lot easier to just pull out a D&D book that I had on the shelf for 20 or 30 or 40 minutes some night to kind of get that fix. But anyway, that was a digression. So no, I have GM for my kids. When I do that, I use kind of like a homebrew that is based on just a whole bunch of things. Sort of, it's D20 based usually, but not always. But I've never been a GM, and I don't have a desire to be. I want somebody to do that for me.
That's interesting, because my experience was perhaps similar. I played once, one very short campaign before we left Australia about 5 years ago of D&D, which was maybe 5 or 6 sessions.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of knew about it broadly, but never really played. And as a player then, I found the conflict that I had was I kept having all these ideas that I thought were really cool for the story or for the character or whatever else. And the other people didn't think that was as cool as I did. And so the story went in a different way.
Right.
And while I know that that's part of the point, it is this collaborative thing, and that's kind of the purpose of it. But I found then, getting into the solo playing, I got that feeling of collaboration with the dice, with the system. But I did want to say as well that the difference, I GM'd my first ever session last week. I was terrified about it. I managed to find a couple of people who are mates, and they're curious but have never played or had any experience at all like that. And they asked me sort of timidly, well, would you be interested? And they had been listening to my podcast. I've been talking to them about it. And they said, oh, would you be interested in trying it? And I thought, well, this is a pretty low risk place to try. We were doing Dragonbane. And I had way more fun than I expected I would. And what was striking to me was how different the fun was and how different the experience was, to the point where, like you say, they almost can't really be compared to one another, I don't think.
Right.
The rule set is still there, and that part of it, when you're rolling dice or whatever else, can be. But the experience of what you're doing otherwise is completely different. And I found it really rewarding, but it does not at all replace what I'm doing in solo or what I want to do with solo, because, it's apples and oranges.
That's great to hear. Yeah. I think in a different life, I'm sure I would love to spend the time to be a GM, but I think for me, I got to find a group.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds really good. I'm just conscious of time here. I haven't read your other book actually, but I do want to mention it. It's called, remind me,
It's called
Wanderings?
Wanderings,
Wanderings.
and thanks for mentioning it. It's a book that it is a compilation of excerpts from mostly Gothic novels. One of the things I did on my channel that people really reacted to positively a long time ago was I showed how you could take novels, and in the case of the demo, I took some Gothic novels and just roll some dice, come up with a page number, and start reading a paragraph from the novel, and then use that as the inspiration for a session that you're going to run. And so people just went crazy for that. And it
Great idea.
caused me to make this book Wanderings, because I recognize that not everybody has access to all these novels. And part of the reason it works is if you sort of have a sense of the novel that you're choosing, even if it's a novel that's 700,000 words long, you want to make sure you're going to get something that will offer you
The juicy bits.
the juicy bits and the fodder for the story you want to tell. So Wanderings is essentially a collection. I think I made it a D88 table of, so I guess that's 64 entries of multiple element selections from mostly Gothic novels from the sort of 1700s to 1900s that you can just roll on that and have, like, I've pre-selected the books and the paragraphs to get something that could be either, it could be a backstory for a character, it could be a story seed for a one-off or a whole campaign. It could just be suggestive of something if you're looking around, within a setting already, and roll on it and see what you get. And of course, I called it Wanderings because that is the concept, that it is narratively expansive and designed for many different types of uses. And it's not, I'll say, I've heard from a lot of people, and I say it in the book, it's not just for solo GMs, it's for sort of any GM who wants to bring in kind of literary fiction into their prep and into the game that they're running.
Yeah. It sounds like a really great idea. I'm familiar with the few or the single table you have in the Solo GameMasters book. I have not purchased or read the other book only because I'm just not really into the Gothic sort of a scene. But I excitedly anticipate when you do a fantasy or a post-apocalyptic one. I guess that's harder.
Well,
because
I will say, Gothic fiction I chose because it is it works for generic fantasy, really.
Okay.
So I'm not pushing that book, but as you say, in the Solo GM guide, I also have a table, totally different entries. I think it's a slightly shorter table, but I also have a table of literary entries in the GM guide, because obviously there's many, many things to choose from. But I selected the Gothic fiction genre because it's kind of like, you could think of it as maybe like just generically maybe spooky, or the Moors, that kind of thing.
Yeah, work with shadow dart, like that kind of a thing. I imagine it's a really fantastic exercise and practice in learning, or at least exercising that creative muscle of taking a small chunk of text, and rather than just reading it and thinking about it word for word, but allowing your creativity and your imagination then to just draw interesting bits out of it and turn it into something else. I imagine that's a really good exercise.
It is. And I like the word that you use, exercise, because in the Solo GM guide, I actually have a few things that I actually called exercises, because I wanted people to feel comfortable and feel like it's okay to experiment in that way. And I think for solo RPG in general, one of the things you need to exercise is your comfort with creating narrative and creating story and working from a prompt, whether it is a paragraph from somebody's novel, or whether it is a word or words from like an action and theme oracle table. Those are the kinds of things that the more you do that, you will actually become better, quote unquote, at it, meaning you will feel better about doing it, and it will be easier for you to do. And those are the kinds of tools and things that, as you strengthen those tools. And as you become more comfortable using them, it will be easier to accomplish, I think, what we look for in solo RPG, which is just the satisfaction of the story unfolding.
Yeah. Wonderful. Very wise words. I expected nothing less from you, Deborah. Thank you so much for taking the time joining me today. I'm going to put in a link in the show notes to both the Solo Game Masters Guide and to Wanderings. There's so much more that I think we could have talked about and that I wanted to talk about, but that just means we'll have to do it again in the not too distant future.
Well, it's totally my pleasure. I really appreciated the invitation, and thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for joining me today on the Solo RolePlayers Podcast. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can email me at soloroleplayerspodcast@gmail.com. You can find links to A Wasteland Story if you want to hear how I solo. Next time on the show, we'll be hearing from another content creator in the solo RPG space. And so until then, happy role-playing.